Down there, life continues. The traffic is awful, stocks go on trading, and Star Trek is still showing.
Good day, grade 8 learners. Welcome to today's Natural Sciences lesson. My name is Patuchezo Singo, and this lesson is proudly brought to you by the Gauteng Department of Education. In today's lesson, we're going to be learning under the knowledge area Life and Living. The topic is interactions and interdependence within the environment, and the subtopic is ecosystems and feeding relationships. Now let's move on to the lesson objectives. At the end of the lesson, you should be able to identify the 4 different levels of interactions between living organisms, describe an ecosystem, describe the biotic and abiotic aspect of the ecosystems, and describe how abiotic factors of the animal affect plants and animals. Then describe the relationship between biotic factors in the ecosystems and describe feeding relationships, as well as classify organisms into their respective feeding groups. All this is sourced from your CAPS document on page 36. All right, let's move on to pre-knowledge. So this is what you've learned before today's lesson. In grade 5 and in grade 6, you were introduced to the concept of an ecosystem and feeding relationships. And in grade 7, under life and living as well, we learned about the biosphere, biodiversity, sexual reproduction in angiosperms, and including sections on pollination. So that was the foundation of today's lesson. Now let's move on to the baseline activity. I'm going to read out the questions for you and then give you time to answer them. So the first question reads, define photosynthesis. The second question is, what is the function of chlorophyll in a plant? The third question is, what are the requirements and products of photosynthesis? I'm giving you 5 minutes to quickly do this activity, and then after 5 minutes, we will do the solutions together. So see you after 5 minutes. Welcome back, learners. Don't forget to send in your responses and any questions that you might have regarding today's lesson on 0779578298. That is the WhatsApp number. You will get a response as soon as you send your questions and answers. Now let's revise the exercise together. The first question was define photosynthesis for 2 marks. Well, here's the definition. Photosynthesis is the process whereby green plants use light for energy from the sun, carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and water from the soil to produce food in the form of glucose. And we have another byproduct, which is oxygen. The second question reads, what is the function of chlorophyll in a plant? For 1 mark, its function is to capture light energy and convert it to chemical potential energy. And then the third question read, what are the requirements and products of photosynthesis? For 5 marks? Okay, so here are the requirements. So in order for the process to happen, this is what we need. We need carbon dioxide, we need water, we need sunlight, and we need chlorophyll, of course, to capture the sunlight. And then what are the products? The products are glucose and oxygen. Give yourself 2 minutes to quickly copy down the corrections and see you after 2 minutes.
Excellent. Excellence is a habit. Excellence is a quality you have, a quality I have. It's a quality we have when we honor what is true to us. Yes, we are gifted differently. uNkulunkulu akasinganga ngokufana. Excellence is striving for your best. Whenever you have a particular project, test, homework, uzibuze, ask yourself, is this my best? Can I put in more effort? Excellence is striving to be in the top 1% of the area in which you are gifted. And so I challenge you, in every single thing that you do, in every single area that you're gifted in, whether it's sports, it's academic, ucula, whatever that gift is, strive for excellence.
Welcome back. Now let's move on to terminology. So these are the important terms that we are going to learn today. The first term is ecosystem. What is an ecosystem? Rather, this covers or refers to all living and non-living things in an environment and the different ways in which they interact with each other. Population refers to a group of individuals of the same species in the same ecosystem. Biosphere refers to different ecosystems on Earth combined. Biotic refers to all living things in an ecosystem as well as their interactions, and abiotic refers to all non-living things in an ecosystem. The next slide, communities. So this refers to different populations that interact with one another in the same ecosystems. Ecology, the study of interactions between living things and their interaction with their physical environment. And then competition, this is when two species need the same limited resource, they are often in competition with one another for that limited resource. And then symbiosis or symbiosis refers to the interaction between species in the same community over a long period of time. Over a long period of time. And then habitat, this is a place where organisms live. That is a habitat. All right, now let's learn about ecology. Let's get introduced to ecology. So living organisms, they interact with one another and the environment as well. So which means living organisms, they interact with one another or together, and they also interact with the non-living parts of their environment. So one example is that organisms depend on other organisms for food. For example, a goat depends on the leaves of shrubs for food, and that shrub is actually a plant. It is a living thing. It is a living organism, and they also need the environment for protection and a place to stay. So they also need the environment. They also, if whether there are animals that live on land or there are animals that live in water, they also need their environment for a place to stay. And studying all of this, studying how organisms interact with other organisms and their environment, is therefore called ecology. This refers to this first slide here, introduction to ecology. So studying all of this, how organisms interact with each other and how they interact with their environment. That study is called ecology. It is called ecology. Now more on ecology. So ecology is basically all about interaction between non-living and living organisms. How do they interact with each other? How does the fish interact with the water that it is swimming on? How does the plant interact with the soil that it is growing from? So all animals, plants, bacteria, protists, and fungi make up the parts that are living, the living parts, and the non-living parts are the condition the organisms need in order to survive. What type of soil is it? So, what type of soil does this plant need in order to grow and to thrive and to reproduce? So those are the interactions that we're talking about, the interactions between the living part of an ecosystem and the non-living part of an ecosystem. So the non-living part, of course, this includes light. How much sunlight is the place getting? Water, how much water is there? Air, and the right temperature and soil. So these are the non-living parts that make up an ecosystem, or the non-living parts that living organisms interact with. Now, interactions are classified in 4 different levels, and here are the levels. We start off with the lowest level, which is population. The next level is communities, followed by ecosystem, and then lastly biosphere. Now let's describe these levels one by one. These levels, so we start off with population. This is the first level, population. A population is a group of organisms of the same species that live in the same area at a specific point in time, and they can interbreed with each other. Organisms of the same species that can interbreed with each other, living in a specific geographic area at a specific time. I've got an example here, a population of elephants. So they are all the same species. They can all interbreed with each other. And if they're living in a certain specific geographic point or in a specific area at the same time, we call them a population. We call them a population. Now, if we move on to community, so these are now different populations. So the populations of organisms that interact with each other in a certain area or live together. So remember, we had that population of elephants. Imagine we call it area A. So we've got area A, and in area A we have a population of elephants. And in that same area, at the same time, at that same period of time, we've got a population of zebras. Then at that same time and place, we have a population of giraffes, a population of cheetahs, a population of lions living together in that same area. We call that a community. So these are populations of organisms that interact in a certain area and live together. So it only doesn't cover animals. Population, remember, it refers to living organisms. So organisms which covers plants, which also covers the microorganisms. So we can have this in this particular botanical garden. We've got different species of plants living in the same garden. Living in the same garden at the same time, or at the same, or within the same time period. Within the certain time period. And then let's move on. Ecosystem. Ecosystem. In ecosystem, it is made up of two parts. That is the non-living environment and the living part. So those are the two parts that make up an ecosystem. So the ecosystem is the interaction between the community. Remember, we said the community is different populations living and interacting together at the same time. So now the ecosystem now refers to the community, the interaction between the community and the non-living environment. How are they interacting? So this is the ecosystem. So there's a picture of of a community which is made up of different populations, and the non-living part here, a non-living part here, we've got water, there's the air, there's the sun. So those are the non-living parts. And then the living parts, we've got a population of lions, zebras, elephants, and other animals. So the interaction between the community and the non-living environment. And then lastly, we have the biosphere. We said all ecosystems on Earth combined make up the biosphere. All of the ecosystems on Earth, if we combine them, they make up the biosphere. So we've got ecosystems on the land, we've got ecosystems in the water, we've got ecosystems in the air. When we combine all these ecosystems, when we combine all of them, then we make up what is called the biosphere. We make up what is called the biosphere. Now, let's talk more on ecosystem. So we said the ecosystem is made of two parts. They are living parts and they are non-living parts. So the non-living parts of an ecosystem, they are known, or rather they influence which organism is capable of living there. The non-living parts, remember, is the air, the sunlight, the soil, the water, the temperature. So those are the non-living part, and they influence which living organism can live in that particular area. So different populations inside a community will depend on each other for food. They need to depend on each other for food, and because an ecosystem is made of living parts and non-living parts. So the living parts are called the biotic factors. The living parts are called the biotic factors, and the non-living parts are called the abiotic factors. So this is the living parts and the non-living parts. living parts and the non-living parts. So there is a picture of an ecosystem. We've got the living parts, which comprises of the flies, the tadpoles, and the water weeds, and the snail, the fish, and the frog. And then the non-living parts is the sun, the water, the soil, and the air, the temperature, or rather the climate in which all these living organisms are surviving in. Now, let's dive into our first activity for today's lesson. Now, we have one question. The study of ecological interaction is divided into 4 levels. Name them and describe them for 8 minutes. I'm going to for 8 marks. Sorry, for 8 marks. I'm going to give you 5 minutes to do this work, and then after 5 minutes, we will do the solutions together. Don't forget to send in your responses or questions to 0795782908. That is our WhatsApp number. See you after 5 minutes. Welcome back, grade 8. Welcome back. So let's revise together. The study of ecological interactions is divided into 4 levels. Name and describe them. So the first level, or one of the levels, is population. This is a group of organisms that are all of the same kind or species living together in the same place at the same time. And then we've got community, 2 or more populations that interact with one another. And then we've got ecosystem, a community and its habitat. A community and its habitat. And then lastly, biosphere. This is a combination of the Earth's ecosystems. A combination of the Earth's ecosystems. Okay, so I'm going to give you 2 minutes to quickly copy down the corrections, then see you after 2 minutes. Welcome back, grade 8. I'm sure you've copied down the corrections. Don't forget to send in responses or any questions that you might have to our WhatsApp number that's on the bottom of the screen. Now, let's move on. Now, let's learn about the parts of an ecosystem. So far we know that an ecosystem is made of 2 parts, living part and the non-living part. And we know that these parts have names. We've got the biotic factors, that's the first part, which also means the living parts. So what exactly are these? What are they? So this covers plants. An example is trees, grass, flowers, all different kinds of plants. These make up, or rather they are part of the biotic factor, or they're part of the biotic components in an ecosystem. Another part is animals. This is example is rabbits, lions, cows, goats, chickens. All these fall under animals. And then there's people, you, me, your friend, your teacher. We make up the living parts of an ecosystem. And then we have microorganisms. Microorganisms, these are organisms that are very, very small for the eye to see. They are too tiny for the eye to see. And one example is yeast. One example is yeast. It's an example of a microorganism that we can find naturally in the ecosystem. It makes up part of the living parts of an ecosystem. Then we've got the abiotic factors, or abiotic components. So these parts, these are the non-living parts that are found on an ecosystem, or they make up an ecosystem. So remember, the ecosystem has 2 parts. We've got the biotic factors and then now the abiotic factors. So let's give some examples. One of them is temperature. Temperature is an example. Then sunlight. How much sunlight is there? Rainfall. This also covers water bodies, ponds, rivers, puddles. And then we've got wind, wind. And lastly, soil. Now, let's describe the abiotic factors further. So the first component or the first abiotic factor is temperature. So temperature basically describes how hot or how cold an area is. So most organisms, they live at temperatures that are between 0 degrees Celsius and 40 degrees Celsius. Temperature also means climate. What kind of organism can live in a particular area that is very cold or very hot? For example, we find penguins in very cold areas. We also find the seals in very cold areas. We find camels in very hot desert, and we find cheetahs and elephants in the savanna type climate. So temperature is an important factor because it determines what kind of organisms are going to live in that particular area, be it a very cold area or a very hot area or a moderately warm area. So temperature is a very important abiotic factor. The next one is wind. Wind is very important because it can play a very important role. It can prevent plant growth and affect animal activities. Some plants utilize the wind for wind pollination and the distribution of its seeds. So how windy a place is can also determine what type of living organisms you are going to find in that particular area. There's a dandelion distributing its seeds using the aid of wind. Next, water. Water is a very, very important factor. Water is life. So water is needed for organisms to survive. Some organisms live in the water, some organisms drink the water. So water is important to all sorts of organisms. Another abiotic factor is sunlight. Remember, plants need sunlight to do what? To photosynthesize. So plants need sunlight for photosynthesis, so it makes it a very important abiotic factor. So how much plants grow in a certain area or which plants grow in a certain area depends on how much sunlight that place receives. So naturally, places that don't receive a lot of sunlight will probably have very few plants, or those that receive too much sunlight, and not all the other factors. So all the factors combined determine which organisms live there. And another important factor is the soil that you and I grow our plants on, the soil that we walk on. So here are different types of soils. So soils are classified as sandy, loamy, or clay soils, and the different properties that these three types of soils have determines or influences the kind of plants that grow in them. Like orchids love to grow on rocky areas or areas with stones, but other plants such as maize, they thrive in clay soils. So the soil type is very important because it determines what type of plant is going to grow there. So this is another important abiotic factor. Now let's combine both the biotic and abiotic components. These two components interact together as a system. One needs the other in order to survive. Like they interact with each other. An example is climate and vegetation. Which one is the abiotic factor here and which one is the biotic factor? Right, the abiotic factor here is climate and the biotic factor is vegetation. So this is an example of two components of an ecosystem interacting with each other. So the climate is going to determine what kind of vegetation grows in that particular area. For example, if it is a tropical climate, you're going to find your very, very tall trees or your palm trees. It depends on what kind. So climate determines what type of living organisms you are going to find there, or what kind of vegetation. So do you see the interaction now between the two? Do you see what I mean by the biotic components and the abiotic components? They interact together as a system. They are capable of interacting together as a system. Now, which brings us to this point. Survival depends on interaction. So the survival of individual organisms and populations depends on whether enough individuals are suited for the environmental conditions at the time, or can they cope with the changes in the habitat. Remember, climate is constantly changing. There's constantly a change in the climate. So are organisms suited for that particular climate, or if there's a change, can they cope with that particular change? For example, temperatures are getting warmer and warmer, or let's say temperatures are getting colder and colder. Can the living organisms that are in a particular area, for example, if the temperature continues rising year after year, cope with the change in temperature in their particular environment, or they move on or die out? Some organisms, however, are able to cope and adapt very, very quickly to these changes because they feed on a large variety of food. They don't have one particular food that they feed on. They have a large variety of food because they can survive on a different range of habitats. Now let's talk about the size of an ecosystem. Is there like a fence that determines how big an ecosystem is? Well, the size of a real ecosystem is not defined in terms of area. You can't just build a fence around it and mark it as ecosystem 1. It is not defined in terms of area. Rather, it is defined by the interaction that occurs inside of that ecosystem. That is what determines it, not the terms of an area. So we have different ecosystems. We've got this grassland here, we've got a forest, we've got a desert, we've got marine, and we also have lakes. All these have different ecosystems within them. So the size of an ecosystem on this grassland is not determined by hectares or square meters, rather by the interactions that happen in it, by the interactions that occur in that particular ecosystem. So what are the types? What are the types of interactions that exist? So species interact in a different number of ways. The interaction of the biotic factors are classified as follows. There is competition, and there is feeding, and there is symbiosis. So these are the 3 interactions. And then symbiosis can also be further broken down as parasitism, mutualism, and commensalism. Now let's describe these interactions. Now, competition. What is competition? I'm sure you've been in competitions before at school, whether it was in athletic or the debate club. So now, within the ecosystem, there is also competition, but this competition is slightly different. So when 2 or more species, or rather when 2 species in an ecosystem need to share a valuable limited resource, often limited resource, for example, water, then they are in competition with each other because they are sharing a limited valuable resource. Like, for example, if you look at this picture here, these animals are drinking water from the watering hole. This looks like a very, very dry area. So they are all these populations are competing for that water, for that one resource. So they are in competition with each other. And then we have feeding. This is when different species in an ecosystem are related and interact when one species can use the other species as a food source. These are called predator-prey relationships. I've got a leopard here, and it's an antelope of some sort. Now, so this is the predator. This is the predator, and here is the prey. The antelope is the prey. The antelope is the prey. So that is a predator-prey relationship, because the leopard depends on the springbok, on the antelope, on the zebra for food. Now let's move on to, remember we said with symbiosis or symbiosis, they can be further broken down into three, right? So with the general definition is, this is when two different species living together in the same community interact with each other over a long period of time. They can interact via parasitism. This is when one species benefits or gains something from the relationship. Remember, it's a relationship between two living organisms, with the other species being harmed in some way, like the mosquito and the human. The mosquito gains blood from the human by sucking blood from the human, but then the human is harmed by getting bites that then are itchy and swell up, and sometimes they can spread disease onto the human. So in this case, the human is not benefiting anything from having the relationship, the parasitic relationship with the mosquito. And then next, we've got mutualism. This occurs between any two species where both of the individuals benefit from the interaction. So both are benefiting. We've got the bird and the buffalo. So the bird picks ticks, or eats the ticks that are in the fur of the buffalo, and then the buffalo gains this by having the ticks removed, so the ticks won't bother the buffalo anymore. So these two are benefiting from the relationship that they have with each other. So the bird is getting food and a free ride on the buffalo's back, and the buffalo is getting a delousing, or it's getting the ticks that bother it removed from its fur. And then lastly, under symbiotic relationships or interactions, we've got commensalism. This is when one species is benefiting from the relationship, but the other one is not being harmed. This a typical example is tree frogs. They use plants for protection. The plant is not being harmed in this relationship, but the tree frog is the only one that is benefiting. It's getting protection, but the tree is not being harmed in any way. Right, let's move on to activity 2. The question reads, what is an ecosystem? What is an ecosystem made up of? And give 3 examples, each for 8 marks. Give yourself 4 minutes to do these questions, or this question, and don't forget to send in your number on, or to send in your responses to 079 578 2908. See you after 4 minutes. Bye-bye. Welcome back, grade 8. Let's answer the question, what is an ecosystem made of, and give 3 examples of each. So I have taken the liberty of listing them for you. It is made up of 2 parts. The first part is biotic, that is the living organism. So example, we've got animals, we've got plants, and we have microorganisms. So these are the examples. And then the abiotic, that is the non-living environment or the non-living part of the environment. Here are some examples. This is temperature, water or rainfall, soil, and sunlight. So these are the non-living parts. Give yourself 1 minute to quickly copy down the corrections. Then after 1 minute, we will continue. Welcome back, grade 8. Now let's move on to feeding types. So living organisms need to feed in order to perform other life processes for survival. So they are classified into 2 groups. We've got producers and we've got consumers. We have consumers. Now the producers, who are the producers? So these are the organisms that make their own food, and they store their food. After making it, they store it as starch. An example is plants that store their food. They make their own food and then store their food as starch. And another word for a producer is autotrophs. So they are also called autotrophs. And then the second group, which is the consumers, these are organisms that cannot produce their own food and they need to eat other organisms for survival. And they are called heterotrophs. They are called heterotrophs. Then under heterotrophs, we've got herbivores, decomposers, carnivores, and omnivores. Now, let's start off with the herbivores. Who are they? These are animals that feed on plants. They eat leaves, seeds, wood, nectar, pollen, and fruits. And herbivores such as cattle or cows feed on grass are called grazers. They are called grazers. And then herbivores such as goats that mainly feed on leaves or shrubs and trees are called browsers. They are called browsers. So those are the herbivores. Then we've got omnivores. These living things eat plants and animals. Even things that eat plants and animals. These are human beings, pigs, certain type of fish, insects, and some dogs. So these are omnivores. And then we've got the carnivores. These are divided into 3 groups. We've got the predators. These hunt other animals for food. Then we have scavengers. They eat dead animals. And then we've got the insectivores. They eat small insects and small non-vertebrates. These are the carnivores. And then we've got the decomposers. These are very, very important. These are organisms that break down or decompose the remains of dead plants and animals and their waste. They are very important to us. They include microorganisms such as bacteria, fungi, millipedes, macroorganisms, bread mold, and some beetles and earthworms. They break down the dead matter into simpler substances which are either eaten or released back into the soil. These nutrients will be taken up by the roots of plants. So they are plowing the nutrients back into the ecosystem. They are recycling the nutrients, which is a very, very important job. So here are some examples of decomposers. We've got a bread mold, which is a decomposer and feeds on dead plants and animals. We've got the dung beetle, which decomposes that only the dung of large animals. And then we've got mushrooms. These are decomposers that decompose by feeding or releasing chemicals called digestive enzymes onto dead matter. So what is their importance? Why are decomposers very important? There's a limited supply of nutrients on Earth, and if they're not recycled by decomposers, those nutrients will be lost forever. They'll be locked up in the bodies of dead plants and animals. So decomposers are important. People also use them to decompose or to break down human sewage, which contains bits of waste, bits of food, and chemical waste. So bacteria will break down the sewage waste and then purify the water. Now, let's do this activity together. Can you classify organisms into their respective feeding groups? Give yourself 2 minutes to do so, then we'll revise together. Welcome back. Now let's classify the organisms together. So we've got the producer. Who falls under the producer? We have plants. And then we've got the consumer. Who falls under the consumer? We have carnivores. We also have herbivores. And we have omnivores. We also have a scavenger that falls under carnivores. Then we've got the predator, and we have the insectivores. And then under the last classification is decomposers. It is decomposers. All right. Now, what did we learn today? Let's wrap up our lesson. So we learned that there are different kinds of feeding relationships that exist amongst living things. And then under the consumers, which we call heterotrophs, we've got herbivores, decomposers, carnivores, and omnivores. And then we also have a different type. We also have producers which produce their own food. And then we also learned about the ecosystem and the interactions that exist within an ecosystem. We learned that there are populations, communities, ecosystem, and then lastly the biosphere, which encompasses all different ecosystems that we find on Earth. We also learned about the different relationships that exist between living things in an ecosystem. We learned that there are different kinds of relationships. We've got competition, where different organisms they compete over often scarce resource. We also learned about symbiosis and the different symbiotic relationships that exist: parasitism, mutualism, and commensalism. All right, now here is the homework activity. Quickly copy down here. I'll read the questions as you're writing them down. Question 1: what are the 4 different levels of interaction between living organisms? Identify and describe the abiotic aspect of the ecosystem and describe how abiotic factors of the animal affect the plant of the environment. Affect the plants and animals of the ecosystem, and describe the relationship between the biotic factors in the ecosystem. All right. In our next lesson, we're going to learn about energy flow, food chains, and food webs. Until next time, bye-bye.